Yesterday, the Liberals chose their new leader. Mark Carney is now the Prime Minister-designate of Canada.
Canadians know that new threats demand new ideas and a new plan. They know that new challenges demand new leadership. Canadians want positive leadership that will end division and help us build together. And to respond, my government will put into action our plan to build a stronger economy, to create new trading relationships with reliable trading partners, and to secure our borders.
That's Mark Carney, and once he is sworn in, Trudeau will officially resign as PM. And it's expected that we'll actually have an election pretty shortly. Today we're getting your thoughts on the new Liberal leader. Does he have what it takes to shepherd Canada through a tumultuous Trump presidency? Before the trade war, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives were widely expected to win the next election. We'll talk to someone who follows the polls closely to see if that's still the case. And of course, we want to hear from you. What are you looking for in a prime minister right now as we face threats from south of the border? How do you see American politics impacting the political landscape in Canada and Saskatchewan? Well, you can call us 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Philippe Fournier is a poll analyst and editor-in-chief with 338 Canada. They make electoral projections based on opinion polls, electoral history, and demographic data. Philippe also co-hosts a podcast with pollster Eric Grenier. And I caught up with Philippe in Ottawa earlier today.
So I spent the weekend in Ottawa for the Liberal Leadership Convention, which, of course, Mr. Carney won in spectacular fashion. And I wanted to take the pulse and do some networking and also get ready for the upcoming campaign because we think it's going to start pretty soon.
And before we talk a little bit about that, what was the atmosphere like at the leadership convention yesterday?
Well, Teresa, if you had asked me what I expected, let's say in December, I would have believed that the mood would have been very somber and humble. But because of all this enthusiasm that we've seen in the past weeks regarding this leadership and, of course, the prospect of a competitive election, something that we had not forecasted just a month ago, it was really enthusiastic. It was really energetic, and I think, of course, it's a small sample size. These were Liberal partisans, but there was something in the air that tells me that perhaps we're going to have a very exciting election this spring.
And I want to talk with you about that in a moment. But were you surprised at all by the results of this Liberal leadership race?
Yes, I was. We had polling data that indicated that Mr. Carney was, I want to say, an overwhelming favorite, but not that much. I don't think anybody I spoke to really believed that Mr. Carney could win almost 86% of the points, win the vote in every single riding, all 343 ridings. That was spectacular. And so the fact that Miss Freeland only had 8% of the points, I think, was the big surprise. I had a friendly wager with a few friends that Mr. Carney was probably going to win on the first ballot. And I expected a first ballot, but not 86% of the points.
You touched on that. This looks now we're going to have a bit of a more competitive federal election ahead of us once it gets called. Remind us, though, before Donald Trump was elected in the United States, the Conservative Party was way ahead in the polls. What has changed since?
Well, if you go on my website, you can track the projections all the way to, let's say, early this year before Monsieur Trudeau announces his resignation on January 6th. And you see that the average of polling, and it's important to stress, the average of polls gave the Conservatives a 25-point lead across the country, which would have led to the greatest parliamentary caucus in Canadian history. Like we were forecasting somewhere around 240 seats for the Poilievre Conservatives. And then Monsieur Trudeau announced his resignation. Of course, the leadership race begins. Monsieur Trump is inaugurated and immediately starts, his threats to Canada sovereignty, the tariffs, of course, that are still ongoing. And then everything changed. Gradually, we saw the numbers tightened, poll after poll after poll, and my projections showed this tightening. And at this point, I updated my numbers yesterday before the victory of Mr. Carney. And it shows now the Conservatives still as the favorite, but in minority territory, not in majority territory anymore. And the Liberals suddenly being competitive. And again, I've been following polls for more than a decade, federally, provincially. I have never seen such a sharp, sudden turnaround in the numbers in my career here.
Okay, so with that, I'll call it Trump and Trudeau effect. Trump becoming US president, Trudeau announcing to step down. How has that changed numbers in the prairies, or has it?
It has a little bit. Of course, we have to be careful with regional data because it contains far more uncertainty. So if we take the global picture of the prairies from Manitoba, Saskatchewan to Alberta, we know that the Conservatives are still the favorite in most ridings, but there are some competitive ridings with those numbers that we have that we'll be looking to see. Northern Saskatchewan should be a good Liberal seat if the Liberals do well in an election, which is not something we would have said in recent weeks. Same thing in Manitoba. Winnipeg was looking bluer and bluer in the projections until Mr. Trudeau resigned. And in Alberta, we know that Alberta, most seats are Conservatives, but there's a few spots in Edmonton and Calgary that will be worth looking at, especially, and I don't want to throw any rumors here, but especially if Mr. Carney decides to run in Edmonton. He repeats, he said it again in his speech yesterday, that he grew up in Edmonton, played hockey there, and if he wants to run in Edmonton, that would really spice things up I think in the numbers and in the province. So there will be some interesting ridings to watch during the campaign in the prairies.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because Ottawa seat to run for that would be safer for him, but I was wondering how much you think it would make a potential change if he decides to run for a seat in Edmonton.
Well, here's the thing. For Mr. Carney to run in Ottawa or even in Toronto, there would be openings for him to run in Toronto. It would be much safer. But I'm not sure that safe is the strategy the Liberals want to take going into this election. They are the underdog. They have to win this one. They have to take risk because not only do they have very strong numbers still for the Conservatives, they also are fighting history. In Canada, usually after about a decade in power, Canadians change governments. So he's really going against the grain here. And Mr. Carney, again, has his work cut out for him. The fact that, let's say he does decide to run in Edmonton, I think it would send a message that he's more fearless than we think he is. And it would also increase the chances of Liberal representation in Alberta.
Overall, how is Mark Carney being received by Canadians who have been polled?
Right. So this is a question that is a moving target right now because so far his favorability numbers are interesting. We had the polling from Abacus Data and also I think the Angus Street Institute polled on Mr. Carney, and the numbers are slightly positive, whereas the other leaders right now are all in the red. However, we have to state that many Canadians, until at least last night, do not know who Mark Carney is. He's still not a known figure. He will become a known figure in a very short time. He will become prime minister in the next few days. But I think many Canadians, perhaps they know the name, they heard about his resume, but they perhaps have not made a strong impression of the man yet. And so I think the numbers that we will see in the next perhaps 2 weeks before the writ is dropped, we expect, will tell us more about what Canadians think of his entrance in Canadian politics.
What are the issues that Canadians care the most about right now?
2 months ago, I would have told you very simply, cost of living and desire for change. Those two issues are still very vibrant in the numbers in the polls that are published regularly. Those two are still very high, but unsurprisingly, the Canada-U.S. relations right now and how to handle Mr. Trump in the White House have shot up in the importance as the most important issues facing Canadians, because you cannot separate cost of living and the tariffs and the threats from the American side. And so I think the ballot box question a few months ago was carbon tax, cost of living, and many of the slogans that Mr. Poilievre was using. But right now, there is no doubt that Canada-U.S. relations will be top of mind for many, many voters in this country. I just wonder, during the campaign, who will Canadians decide is best suited to deal with the American administration? That we do not know yet.
Philippe Fournier, he's a poll analyst and editor-in-chief with 338 Canada. They make electoral projections based on opinion polls, electoral history, and demographic data. He also co-hosts a podcast with pollster Eric Grenier. It's called The Numbers. And I would like to welcome our next guest to the show. Daniel Westlake is a political science professor at the University of Saskatchewan. He'll be with us for the remainder of the show. And of course, we always want to hear from you. If you have any thoughts on the new Liberal leader or questions for Daniel, you can call us at 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Daniel, first of all, welcome to Blue Sky and thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, did you expect Mark Carney to win the Liberal leadership race, especially in the way that he did yesterday?
Not in the way that he did. I mean, the vibes that I got, the sense was that he was the front runner. But these things are really hard to poll and get a good sense of because you have to figure out how candidate support is distributed. If it is a close race, you have to figure out where second choices for other candidates might go. And you've got to figure out how many kind of, not just where the population is, but where people who have signed up and are going to show up and vote in the Liberal contest are. So I'm always very skeptical when it comes to polling and projections on these things. More than 80% is a lot. And it is remarkable to me that Chrystia Freeland or Karina Gold couldn't pick up a larger share of the points or, for that matter, the votes in the contest. And I wonder what that says about the Liberal Party and their ability to get a number of strong candidates to contest the leadership. I would have expected a stronger showing from both of those two candidates.
So why do you think Mark Carney did so overwhelmingly well?
It's hard to know. I mean, without data on why people voted, it's hard to know for sure. My instinct is, the case that he makes for himself is that he's an experienced set of hands, yet he hasn't been in the Liberal cabinet. So it's a little bit easier for Carney to get some distance from a Trudeau government that's unpopular, but he doesn't come off as inexperienced. He can make the case that he's got experience in the Bank of Canada and experience in the Bank of England dealing with economic crises, and we're headed into an economic crisis as a result of tariffs. So I think the case for Carney is fairly clear. I'm just a bit surprised that Freeland or Gold weren't able to make stronger cases. Gold a case to more center-left-leaning Liberals. And you saw it when she said in the debate, she talked about Carney there's a danger there that he comes off as conservative light. I'm surprised that case didn't resonate with more voters. I don't expect that Gold would have won, but I'm surprised she wasn't able to convince more Liberals to support her. And Freeland being more experienced and having a history of being in politics and understanding politics, I'm surprised that didn't convince more people to support her. And again, not necessarily surprised that they lost, but less than 10% for both. That's a really weak result, not what I was expecting.
Daniel, I want to hear switch quickly to one of our listeners, Chris in Regina, and his impression of Carney. Hi there, Chris. Thanks for calling.
Yes, good afternoon. So just wanted to add my 2 cents worth to the discussion. I expected Mark Carney would win. Like many others, I don't think I thought he would have such an overwhelming share of the vote. But I think for the Liberal Party, he was probably the best choice because he certainly does have a history with the Canadian government, but he was not part of the Trudeau administration. And of course, I think they looked at the polls and they wanted to get some distance. And I also like the fact about Carney that perhaps he is a little more conservative. I think that will perhaps play well against Pierre Poilievre. And I'm not a Liberal supporter, but I do watch politics carefully. And I like the fact that they've got a candidate who's maybe a little more centrist because my take on it is anybody but Poilievre. He presents himself as a populist, but if you look at his voting record over the years, he has consistently voted against measures that would benefit working and middle class Canadians. And so, I like Mark Carney's chances against him.
Chris, thanks so much for your call.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Daniel, do you think Chris has a point there that maybe a bit of a more conservative twist here by Mark Carney might be the success, why he did so well yesterday?
It could, but I think there's some risk involved in that. There's a danger, and if I'm the Liberals, I'm worried on carbon tax and I'm worried on capital gains, that Carney's essentially taking positions that the Conservatives have had for a number of years now and have been very vocal about that. And so if as a voter, your main concern is the carbon tax, you're probably not voting for the Liberal Party. The Conservatives are just probably more credible on that issue. If you're voting on low taxes, again, the Conservatives probably have more credibility, even though Carney has shifted the Liberals. I think Carney's best case to voters is probably twofold. One, experienced set of hands, Bank of Canada, Bank of England, that sort of case, basically to leverage himself and try to come off as more prime ministerial. And then second to, and this is related, make the case, the anybody but Poilievre case, that even if he has shifted the party a little bit more to the center or center-right, that progressives should stick with him because he's better than the Conservative alternative. That's a case that can work, but I don't think it's a slam dunk. I think that there's still risk involved with taking that approach.
Daniel, we have a question for you from Marvin in Carrot River. I'm let him ask him the question directly. Hi there, Marvin.
Hello. Well, I find it interesting that Mr. Carney was appointed to the Bank of Canada by Stephen Harper, so he has connections to the Conservative Party. But my question is, would the voters of Canada not lean more towards Mr. Carney because he would be the opposite of what Mr. Trump is in the United States?
Thank you, Marvin. Daniel, what's your answer there?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a possibility. I think, again, there's risk involved in where the Liberals want to go with this. I think Trump is not popular in Canada to the extent that the Liberals can establish a contrast between them and Trump. That can work for them. But the bigger question with Trump, I think, is who best can deal with him. And there, I think Carney can make a reasonable case, but I think Poilievre is also trying to make his case. And the danger for the Liberals here is if they try to cast Pierre Poilievre as Donald Trump, I think they're going to run into trouble. Because Pierre Poilievre, I think, has himself tried to get some distance from Trump, and he's been pretty clear on the tariff issues that he is not supportive of what the United States are doing, and he is a bit of a different type of politician. And so it can work as a strategy, but there's risk. They have to pitch themselves as being able to deal with Trump, not just the Conservatives as a Republican-style kind of American-style Conservative Party, because the Conservatives aren't. And over the course of the campaign, I think the Conservatives will reveal to themselves to be somewhat different, and a charge that they're just kind of a Canadian version of Trump can start to sound a bit hollow if that's the way the campaign ends up going.
We got an email from Keith there, Daniel. It says, I know quite a few people who thought Trump was great, and also I love Poilievre's Trump-style rhetoric and anger. We don't need angry, divisive politics now or ever. Thank you for that email, Keith. Daniel, I'm wondering Trump has a very distinct way of doing politics. How much have you seen that bleeding into the rhetoric here in Canada over the last month?
There are certainly elements of it, but the populism that we see in Canada, and I think this goes back beyond the last month to really the last decade, does have a distinct spin. You do get some of the anti-elite rhetoric out of both Pierre Poilievre and other conservative politicians in Canada. Doug Ford strikes me as one of the obvious ones in this case. And so you do get elements of that rhetoric leading in. But politicians also understand that they are competing in a Canadian context. And that means adjusting that rhetoric and adjusting their policies to reflect that. So especially, we don't hear the same demonization of immigrants, I think, from conservative politicians in Canada that we see in the United States. And part of that is electoral self-interest, right? Pierre Poilievre knows that he needs to win in Mississauga and Brampton in a way that Donald Trump doesn't have similar places where he needs to win. And so that rhetoric gets tempered, and the policy issues that get focused on get tempered and changed. Poilievre said some pretty rough stuff and some, I think, concerning stuff during the leadership campaign. But I think it's remarkable to me that since he's become conservative leader, he's tried to emphasize, with a populist spin on it, issues that resonate more broadly. And so the carbon tax becomes front and center in his campaign. Cost of living and housing becomes front and center in his campaign. So that populism is certainly there, and there's certainly stuff to be concerned about. But again, he's not Donald Trump. And I think if progressives try to paint him as Donald Trump, that's probably a strategy that's not going to work.
I want to very quickly, we have about a minute left, go to one more listener. Sam in Saskatoon want to share her thoughts on Carney. Hi there, Sam. Share her thoughts on Carney.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I find your guest, you introduced him as a political prof from the University of Saskatchewan. I'm surprised he didn't expect Mark Carney to win with such huge majority.
I think he expected him to win, just not by, if I recall his answer, Daniel.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And he's surprised why Christian Freeland lost so much support. But if he had closely followed what she did just before the party had to call a leadership, people were disappointed how she kind of backstabbed Trudeau at the last minute. Besides that, what I noticed is Daniel's support for, more or less, for Pierre Poilievre is kind of puzzling to me. How can he say that he is not close to Trump? In my mind, our Premier, Mr. Moore, Daniel Smith, Pierre Poilievre, and Trump are all cut from the same cloth. And their policies, politics, how they have gone about doing things, to me, I find if we don't win a big majority, hopefully with the support of the NDP, at the end, Canada will be in deep trouble if Pierre Poilievre were to be the Prime Minister.
Sam, thank you so much for your call. We have to go to news headlines there, but I really appreciate your input there. Thank you, Sam.
Can I just say one thing here?
Yes, Daniel. Of course, I should let you respond to this. Yeah.
Yeah. I should be very clear. I don't want to come off here as supporting one party or another, particularly not Pierre Poilievre. What I think we need to understand, I think it's tempting to paint everybody on the right on the same brush. And I think missing the nuances that exist on the right will lead us to misunderstand the politics that we are in Canada, and I think could be a mistake. That shouldn't be read as support for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party or any other party for that matter.
We are talking today about the new Liberal leader and Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney. And we got another caller on the line, James in Saskatoon. Hi there, James, and thanks for calling the Blue Sky.
Hi, yeah. I'm glad to see Carney in there because he is originally from Western Canada, which is a good thing. But the whole, I guess, the legacy that Justin inherited from his father has really bothered Western Canadians. I look at Mark Carney as being, I used to think of him as a red Tory because of his fiscal conservatism, but his progressive social nature. Now I think he's more of a blue liberal, which is basically the same. But the Canadian economy up through involving more Canadian products and also through expanding our trade relations. I remember when Brian Mulroney brought in the free trade agreement, and during that, he one of his things was that we would get more interchange between Canada and the U.S., and he said that we'd probably lose 30,000 rail workers because they wouldn't be going into the U.S., but we didn't increase our trucking population or our truckers by 100,000. And that wasn't a really great policy because now we no longer have a good rail system, and we have our highways destroyed by the trucking industry. So, I look at the difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals now, and I know that Poilievre, all he wants to do is reaffirm the Christian right and put wedge issues in instead of good political decisions. Poilievre isn't an economist, and he really does not know how businesses work because he's never been an employee of business. That's about all I have to say.
James, thank you so much. Thank you, James, for your call. I want to quickly bring another guest into this conversation. Jeff Walters is now on the line. He is running for the Liberal Party here in Saskatchewan, the seat that has formerly been held by Saskatchewan's lone Liberal, Ralph Goodale. Jeff, hi, and thanks for joining Blue Sky today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Very good. What do you make of Mark Carney's win last night?
Well, it was overwhelming. That was interesting. I don't know if we actually all saw that coming, but it's a good thing for a number of levels. I mean, obviously, he's perfectly qualified for the issues that we have facing us right now with regard to what's happening down in the South. And at the end of the day, I mean, it really was a nice show of solidarity from at least the Liberal Party to, back a person that is obviously eminently qualified, as I said.
I listened to the live event yesterday. I heard a lot of enthusiasm there, but the Liberals are not polling rather very well here in Saskatchewan. What do you think your chances are of gaining any ground here in our province?
Well, it's no doubt that we have some challenges here. I mean, obviously, and those challenges have been almost generational at this point. But I truly feel over the past 6 weeks, things have turned a corner for the most part. And we have to remember that, this is Saskatchewan, and we have 14 ridings with 14 Conservative MPs right now. They are, in fact, the incumbents. And I think it's up to them to let the voters know what they've been doing for the past 6 years and if they're actually worth to keep on. They're the incumbents here, not the Liberal Party. And I think that it's time for people to challenge them to ensure that they are, for the most part, we're getting our money's worth.
Okay, an election is expected to be called shortly. You mentioned there's 14 ridings. Are you and your team ready here in our province?
Yes, we are. We've been ready for a few months now. We're just waiting for things to happen. We have everything in place, and we're really looking forward to a nice spirited campaign.
So you have candidates for all the 14 ridings available?
I can't personally speak for the party, but I do know offhand that when the election is called within the next couple of weeks, perhaps there will in fact be a candidate for every riding.
All right, and earlier we talked with poll analyst Philippe Fournier, and as of his latest projections, the Liberals could potentially win a seat in the north here. What about Liberal candidates in northern Saskatchewan?
Oh, they're absolutely ready, and he's right. Fournier is right. So the one northern riding, is looking very good for the party now, but I wouldn't discount Regina Wascan and a couple others to be sleepers. If the polls keep going how they have been going this past few weeks, I think that all bets are off.
Before I let you go, what are you hearing from voters in Saskatchewan, regarding the issues that seem to matter the most right here?
The past few weeks, there has been a radical change as to what we have been focusing on, and everything, for the most part, what we've been hearing and what we've been seeing is the challenges from our southern neighbors. We're Canadians, we're Canada strong, that's one of the things that have been popped up, and I'm very, very grateful and happy to be part of a party that we can unify everybody and do what's best for the country at large.
Jeff, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Jeff Walters is the Liberal candidate for Regina Wascana. And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Mark Carney as the new Liberal leader? What are you looking for in a Prime Minister? You can reach us here on Blue Sky, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Going back now to our guest today, Daniel Westlake is a political science professor at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm wondering, Daniel, with Carney's announcement to scrap the carbon tax, how much do you think that will make a difference for the Liberals right here in our province?
I'm skeptical as to how much. I think I wouldn't want to read too much into that. To me, this seems like a defensive move, in the sense that I think the Liberals are right to be concerned that they could lose some votes over the carbon tax, and maybe that prevents them from losing some of those votes. But if you're a voter that really cares about resource development, that's really hardcore, like strongly opposed to the carbon tax, the Conservative Party is just a more credible party on that particular issue. The risk for the Liberals on this one, it's not so much a risk in Saskatchewan, but there's a risk in other places, that they can lose environmentalist voters who say, well, I got into the Liberal Party because I liked what they were doing on the carbon tax. Suddenly maybe those voters are looking for another party. So it's a defensive issue. And I think the problem with the defensive issue is it's not going to turn a place like Saskatchewan, that has large amounts of Conservative support and there's a lot of people that work in the resource industry to suddenly look at the Liberal Party. It may prevent or help them kind of avoid bleeding some support on some cost of living issues. But I would be nervous as a Liberal as to how much that issue is going to help them.
Daniel, we're getting a lot of calls today. I have another one on the line. Donalda in Regina. Good afternoon, and thanks for calling us on Blue Sky.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's interesting. I just became a new registered member of the Liberal Party, and I live in Regina Wascana, Ralph Goodale's old riding, and so it was nice to hear Jeff speaking before. My biggest thing about this is the tone. I hear Pierre Poilievre, and I can't even listen to him. And I was thinking about that is what so attracts me to the Liberal Party right now, is it's firm, but not triggering people's nervous systems that they're so triggered that they just stay in terror. And I think that's the leadership, is to say we are Canadians, we've got a road ahead of us, but we don't have to be afraid. And we can do this. And so that's where I think that if the Conservatives need to change their rhetoric.
That's so interesting that you just recently signed up. Have you seen other folks around you do that?
Well, I was actually trying to. There was a little bit of a complication, I have to say, about voting, but I was able to vote, and it was. Yeah, there were people, but I don't think that they actually knew, and I just felt like I had to do something, and I thought, well, I can lend my voice to the Liberal Party and vote. So, and I actually felt, I watched the whole thing yesterday. I felt very good about Carney, and I have to say, I really miss Ralph Goodale coming from this riding. I don't feel served from the progressive conservative person in our riding, and I actually hope. I don't know Jeff, but I wish him well.
Donalda, I really appreciate sharing your experience and your thoughts with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Bye now.
Bye now. Daniel, she talked a little bit about the tone, and I want to play quickly some of Mark Carney's victory speech from last night.
I am a pragmatist above all. So when I see that something's that's not working, I will change it. So my government will immediately eliminate the divisive consumer carbon tax on families and farmers and small and medium-sized businesses. And we will stop the hike in the capital gains tax because we think builders should be incentivized for taking risks and rewarded when they succeed. Canada needs more of this type of change. Change that puts more money in people's pockets. Change that makes our companies more competitive. Change that builds the strongest economy in the G7. Now, there's someone who's trying to do the opposite. There's someone who's trying to weaken our economy. Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed. And we won't. We won't. I am proud of the response of Canadians who are making their voices heard and their wallets felt. I am grateful for how our provinces are stepping up to the fight, because when we are united, we are Canada strong.
That was Mark Carney talking yesterday. Daniel, he touched on this whole, people wrapping themselves in Canadian flags. How has this threat from Trump changed what people are looking for in a leader here in Canada?
Well, I think it puts an issue on the table that is not necessarily bad for the Liberals. I think as the incumbent governments get punished for bad economic circumstances, they get punished for bad problems, like problems in the healthcare system, regardless of whether they actually were the cause of those problems or not. And I think those were issues that were really strong drags on the Liberal Party prior to Trudeau's resignation and prior to the Trump tariffs. The tariffs are not that kind of issue that's going to cause a major problem for the Liberals. They're in a reasonable competition with the Conservatives over who is best able to handle that issue. And so being able to shift the focus, at least somewhat, I don't want to say cost of living doesn't matter, because it still does. But being able to shift it to add in this other issue that's not as damaging for them, I think is a real benefit to the party. So the Liberals, I think, will want to be talking about who is best to stand up to Trump, who is best to approach tariffs, those kinds of issues as much as possible, because I think it gives them, it's an issue on which they can make a better case to Canadians than they can perhaps on some of the other potential issues the election could be about.
I want to go to another caller. Before, actually, I would like to talk a little bit about what's next kind of thing. But first, let's check in with Don in Regina. Hi there, Don.
Hi. Hi.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think they got a good leader. I mean, for the Liberals, I think he's going to do a good job. I think tone is the question. He's certainly not, he's not like their... Well, he's not like TP, put it that way. Anyway, I don't know why people aren't more interested in what's happened to Andrew Scheer in the whole question. He's just been not nowhere to be found on any of this. They seem to have put him away. He's the House leader, and I've not heard very much at all. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that he sits there with dual citizenship. He's dual Canadian American citizenship, and I wonder why people aren't more concerned about that. I'm certainly concerned.
Thank you, Don, for sharing that thought, and that kind of brings me a little bit, Daniel, to another question we got from a listener. So we now know that Mark Carney is going to be running for the Liberal Party, but will it be for sure that Pierre Poilievre is leading the Conservatives into the next election, Daniel?
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't see any scenario in which he would step down. I mean, the Conservatives have seen a drop in support from their high at, I think it was 45 or 46%, but they're still leading in the polls. And I think it's also important to put the Conservative numbers in context. More than 40% is really hard for the Conservatives to get. You have to go back to the 1980s to find an election, a federal election, in which the Conservative Party won more than 40% of the vote. And that includes Stephen Harper in 2011. He was at like 39.5 or 39.6 or what have you. So this is, I mean, the Conservatives still are in a relatively strong position compared to where they've been in the past. There's no reason to get rid of Poilievre in that kind of situation, unless you just don't like him, which fair enough. There's lots of reasons why one might not like Poilievre, but it's hard to imagine the Conservatives going with anybody else in the next election.
Okay, I want to now look a little bit ahead. For now, Carney is the Prime Minister-designate. So what are the next steps now?
Well, they're going to have to swear him in as Prime Minister. Trudeau will have to resign first, and then Carney will be sworn in, and he'll have to appoint a cabinet. Then it's up to Carney. He's got a choice as to whether he wants to ask for an election or whether he wants to meet Parliament and try to establish some kind of governing agenda and see if the opposition parties will let him establish kind of a governing record, or whether he wants to go to voters straight away. Most of what I've heard from news coverage and various speculation is that it's more likely that he will ask for an election. And I mean, it's not clear that if he goes back to Parliament that he'll be able to survive, right? He could lose a non-confidence vote and have to face an election anyway. So I think we're probably looking at an election fairly quickly.
And I'm just, what time? So you touched on that it's probably going to be very soon. But what would be best for the Liberals time-wise? Like to do it ASAP, or just to wait a little bit until March 24?
There's always trade-offs to be made in these types of decisions. Unless the NDP was to come out and say that they were to support the Liberals, and I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that they will, part of me thinks you might as well go to an election, right, rather than losing a throne speech vote and basically having to have the election soon anyways. There are concerns with waiting. The longer we wait, the greater the likelihood that bump in the Liberal polling numbers starts to dissipate, right? Whenever you've kind of had a major gain in the polls, there's always a question as to how solid that will be over time. And the longer the Liberals wait, the greater the risk that polling bump starts to decline. Might not necessarily, but you don't know that, when you're trying to decide whether an election should happen or not. So my instinct is earlier is better, but the advantage to waiting longer and trying to govern is Carney can actually do things. And so he couldn't get rid, if he wants to, he can try to pass legislation getting rid of the carbon tax. He can put forward some policy initiatives that he can then campaign on. That is contingent on him having enough support in the House of Commons to do that. And that's an open question. So it's why I think maybe an early election is more likely. But there's a trade-off to be made here.
You are listening to Blue Sky, and we are talking about the Mark Carney, the new Liberal leader. And of course, we want to hear from you. What are you looking for in a prime minister right now as we face threats from south of the border? How do you see American politics impacting the political landscape in Canada and Saskatchewan? Or do you have any questions for our guest, Daniel Westlake? He's a political science professor at the University of Saskatchewan. You can call us. We have time maybe for another call, 1-800-716-2221. Daniel, Carney currently does not hold a seat in the House of Commons. He is from Edmonton, But running in Ottawa, I understand, would be much safer. Where do we expect him to run, or where do you rather expect him to run for his seat?
So I don't know what's in what he's thinking in this respect. He's got options. The Edmonton option that PJ Fournier was suggesting, that's a really strong risk. I'm guessing if he's going to run in Edmonton, it'd be Edmonton Centre, and there's no guarantee the Liberals win that seat, even if the Liberals are riding high and do well in an election. And it probably doesn't look good to have a leader lose a seat in an election. So I think that's a high-risk strategy, and I'd be surprised if they take it. There are seats in Ottawa and Toronto, and Carney will have to make a decision as to where he's most comfortable running. And you'll have to also look at who is stepping down from caucus, who doesn't want to run again, or who'd be willing to give up a seat to allow him to run. Because if Carney runs in a place, somebody else can't run there. And so Carney will have to manage those relationships and look for a place where he's comfortable running, where hopefully the Electoral District Association, the local Liberals, are comfortable with him running, and where there's an opening, where somebody is willing to make space for him, or where he's comfortable asking somebody to step aside to allow him to run. And those are complicated internal decisions that Carney and the Liberal Party will have to make.
I want to touch one more time on the Conservative Party. We've heard a lot from listeners about their thoughts, about the tone. I'm just wondering, how do you think they're gonna... I mean, they have already changed gears in a way of criticizing the Liberals. The axe taxing is pretty much off now, with Carney saying he will do that anyway. How do you think they will focus on attacking Mark Carney in the next weeks ahead?
My instinct is we're probably going to see a fairly populist message. The axe the tax stuff may be downplayed a bit, but they're going to, I mean, my instinct or my guess would be that they'll try to tie Carney as much as possible to the Liberal government and the Trudeau government that's unpopular. Open question as to whether it will work, but it strikes me as an obvious strategy for them to try. And I think we could see some populism and anti-elitism. The fact that Carney is, I mean, and this is a contested issue, right? A lot of people might like, and certainly a lot of callers have suggested that they like the fact that Carney's got a lot of experience, that his Bank of Canada and his time in Department of Finance bode well for him and make him look like a credible prime minister. The flip side of that is if you're trying to mobilize an anti-elite message, those things can be used to paint Carney as an elite. So there's a clear contrast that can be drawn there between a Conservative Party that perhaps is more populist and a Liberal Party that is more experienced. And that has these kinds of, and Carney who has these kinds of expertise. And I expect the Conservatives to try to draw that contrast in a way that's favorable to them, and the Liberals to respond in kind, to try the same kind of contrasts, and where the Conservatives might describe Carney as somebody who's an elite, who doesn't understand the concerns of kind of Canadians and on Main Street and in their kitchens, the Liberals to then turn around and say, well, no, Carney is somebody who is experienced, who can manage the economy, can deal effectively with an uncertain situation, and Poilievre doesn't have that experience. So there's a clear contrast that can be drawn there, and I expect both parties will try to draw that.
Daniel, we have another caller. James in Saskatoon is on the line. Hi there, James.
Hey, thank you so much for taking my call. So I'm sure time is tight, so I'll get kind of quickly to all of my points. First of all, I would say that to say that Mark Carney's victory was a landslide, I'm a little challenged with that, because I look at the total amount of registered Liberal voters, right? And I believe the number was 403,000. Of that, he only received 131,000 of the total. So that equates to me somewhere around 30-some%. I don't know, 32, 37, something like that. So I don't know if that's necessarily... Now, of the people who did receive votes, sure, he was the leader of the pack, but once again, I think overall, when I see 400,000 people register, I find it rather odd that only 130 of them voted. But having said that, I do think that it lends itself to an interesting question: is does Mark Carney's resume as a central banker actually help or hinder him in a go-forward basis of a discussion with Donald Trump? Because it's not necessarily that this is somebody that is akin to the business world, but it's more so, are you a globalist or are you not a globalist?
Yeah.
And the rationale...
I just have to, because we have only a couple seconds left. Daniel, your last maybe quick response here. We have 30 seconds left for you here. I saw you nodding along.
Well, I think that's the question. Does his experience help or hinder him, both in negotiations with Trump and in the election? And to me, the answer to that depends on how he presents it, and depends on how the Liberal Party is able to use that experience to present him as somebody who perhaps understands what's going on, versus, the risk that he's painted as an elite.
Daniel, this was so interesting, and our callers really appreciate you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. I'm Theresa Klim, filling in for Sam McCack today.